This is a map of global silver production. The blue dots represent operating silver mines. Notice the concentration, not scattered across the globe like copper or iron ore. Clustered, concentrated, vulnerable. Mexico produces 196 million ounces of silver annually, 24% of global output, the world's largest producer by a wide margin. Peru produces 140 million ounces, 17% of global output, the second largest. Together, these two nations account for 336 million ounces of the 830 million ounces mined worldwide every year. At 6 a.m. Eastern this morning, both nations announced coordinated export restrictions on refined silver and silver concentrates. Not tariffs, not quotas, restrictions. Mexico's decree, published in the Diario Oficial at midnight Mexico City time, prohibits the export of silver in any form without explicit authorization from the Ministry of Economy. Peru's decree, announced simultaneously by President Boluarte, mirrors the Mexican measure almost word for word. The authorizations, according to both decrees, will be granted consistent with national strategic priorities and domestic industrial requirements. Translation: we decide who gets silver. We decide how much. We decide at what price. 336 million ounces, 41% of global mine supply, just became subject to government permission. And the governments that control that permission have made clear that their priority is domestic industry, not international markets. But 41% isn't the full picture. The export bans apply to refined silver. The mines in Mexico and Peru don't just produce refined silver, they produce silver concentrate that gets shipped to refiners in China, Japan, and Europe. When you add the concentrate flows that these restrictions will disrupt, the effective supply impact reaches 68% of global silver reaching international markets. 2 countries, 2 decrees, 68% of tradable silver supply. This is the most significant supply shock in the history of the silver market, and it happened while you were sleeping. Here's what they're not telling you. The coordinated announcement wasn't coincidence. These decrees were negotiated over months, coordinated through diplomatic channels, and timed for simultaneous release to maximize impact and minimize the window for market manipulation before implementation. The coordination was visible to anyone watching. In September 2025, Mexico's President Sheinbaum met with Peru's President Boluarte at the United Nations General Assembly. Their joint statement mentioned cooperation on strategic minerals, without elaboration. In November, the Mexican Senate passed enabling legislation for critical mineral export management, authority that seemed academic until this morning. In December, Peru's Congress passed similar legislation. The legal infrastructure was built in public view. The decrees simply activated what was already constructed. The stated rationale is industrial policy. Mexico is building a solar panel manufacturing industry, subsidized by $8 billion in government incentives announced last year. Solar panels require silver, approximately 20 grams per panel. Mexico currently exports 85% of its silver production while importing solar panels from China. The economic logic of exporting raw material and importing finished goods has become politically untenable. Peru's rationale is similar. The government is promoting domestic electronics manufacturing and battery production. Both require silver. Peru currently exports virtually all of its silver output, while domestic manufacturers import silver-containing components from Asia. The circularity is absurd once you state it plainly. Peru ships silver to China. China manufactures electronics. Peru imports the electronics. The export ban breaks that cycle. But industrial policy doesn't require simultaneous announcements at 6 a.m. Eastern. It doesn't require identical language drafted by lawyers who clearly shared templates. It doesn't require coordination that blindsided markets at the moment of maximum illiquidity. The coordination signals something beyond industrial policy. It signals that resource nationalism, the assertion that nations have the right to prioritize domestic needs over international markets, has arrived in silver. And once it arrives for silver, it arrives for every critical mineral that follows the same concentrated production pattern. This is where the lie becomes unsustainable. To understand why the export restrictions will devastate global silver supply, you need to understand how the silver supply chain actually functions. Silver mining rarely produces pure silver. It produces ore containing silver alongside lead, zinc, or copper. The ore gets processed into concentrate, a slurry containing 30 to 60% silver along with other metals. The concentrate gets shipped to smelters and refiners, primarily in Asia, where the silver is separated and purified. Mexico ships approximately 85 million ounces of silver equivalent in concentrate to refiners in China, Japan, South Korea, and Europe annually. Those refiners process the concentrate and sell refined silver to industrial users, solar panel manufacturers, electronics companies, medical device makers. The refined silver reaches global markets through these intermediary steps. Peru ships approximately 70 million ounces of silver equivalent in concentrate through similar channels. The combined flow, 155 million ounces of concentrate-derived silver, represents supply that reaches international markets through refining chains that begin in Latin America. The export restrictions don't just prohibit refined silver exports. They prohibit concentrate exports without authorization. The refiners in China and Japan who depend on Mexican and Peruvian concentrate for feedstock will not receive that feedstock. Their output will decline. The refined silver they would have produced will not reach markets. The immediate impact is 336 million ounces of Mexican and Peruvian refined and semi-refined silver that will no longer flow to international buyers without government approval. The secondary impact is another 220 million ounces of silver that would have been refined from concentrate by third-country refiners. Combined impact, 556 million ounces of silver supply, 68% of global mine production, now subject to two governments' discretionary authorization. At 7:45 a.m. Eastern, silver futures on the COMEX opened limit up, $12 above Friday's close, the maximum move allowed before trading is halted. The exchange halted trading for 15 minutes under circuit breaker rules. When trading resumed, silver immediately hit the expanded limit, $18 above Friday's close. Another halt. As of this recording, silver is indicated at $94 per ounce, up from $76 on Friday. A 24% move that would be larger if the exchange weren't constraining price discovery through circuit breakers designed for orderly markets that no longer exist. The circuit breakers are preventing the market from discovering the true price. When they're finally removed, or when physical markets open in London and Shanghai, the price discovery will be violent. When supply shocks hit concentrated markets, the price response isn't linear, it's exponential. Silver's supply-demand balance was already precarious before this morning. Global demand of 1.24 billion ounces against supply of 1.01 billion ounces created a structural deficit of 230 million ounces annually. That deficit was being filled through inventory drawdowns, above-ground silver stocks declining year after year. The export restrictions don't just widen the deficit, they create a supply crisis that inventories cannot bridge. COMEX registered inventory stands at 31 million ounces. LBMA vault holdings total approximately 850 million ounces, but most of that is committed to ETFs, industrial users, and allocated accounts. Freely available inventory, metal that can actually reach new buyers, is perhaps 200 million ounces globally. Against that inventory, we now have 68% of annual mine supply subject to export authorization that may not come. If Mexican and Peruvian silver stops flowing entirely, the worst-case interpretation of the decrees, global available supply falls from 830 million ounces to 274 million ounces, against demand of 1.24 billion ounces. A 966 million ounce supply gap, in a market with 200 million ounces of available inventory. The inventory covers 75 days of the gap. After that, silver becomes unavailable at any price. The price that balances supply and demand under these conditions isn't $94. It isn't $150. It's whatever price destroys 966 million ounces of demand annually, roughly 80% of current consumption. The demand destruction required to balance a market with 68% of supply restricted is unprecedented in any commodity market in modern history. Less than 72 hours remain before the restrictions take formal legal effect at midnight Wednesday local time in both countries. Between now and then, traders, refiners, and industrial users are scrambling to secure every ounce of silver they can from Mexican and Peruvian sources before the window closes. Ships currently loading at Mexican ports, the port of Manzanillo handles most silver concentrate exports, are racing to complete loading and clear customs before the deadline. Legal teams are filing for emergency authorizations under the vague national strategic priorities language of the decrees. Refiners are offering premiums to existing contract holders to accelerate deliveries. The scramble is creating its own supply distortions. Metal that would have reached markets over the next month is being pulled forward to beat the deadline. The immediate flow will spike, then collapse when the restrictions take effect. While one side restricts, the other side retaliates. The US and European response to the export restrictions is already taking shape, and it risks making the crisis worse. At 9:30 a.m. Eastern, the White House issued a statement expressing deep concern about the restrictions and announcing that national security staff were evaluating all options to ensure continued silver supply. The phrasing, all options, is diplomatic code for potential retaliation. The options under consideration reportedly include sanctions on Mexican and Peruvian mining officials, tariffs on other exports from both nations, and invocation of trade agreement dispute resolution mechanisms. USMCA, the trade agreement governing U.S.-Mexico commerce, prohibits export restrictions on raw materials absent critical shortage. The U.S. interpretation is that no shortage existed before the restrictions. The restrictions themselves created the shortage. Mexico's interpretation is that the domestic industrial development constitutes a strategic priority that supersedes trade obligations. Trade lawyers are already drafting briefs. The dispute will take months or years to resolve through official channels. In the meantime, the silver isn't flowing. The European Union faces a more complex situation. The EU imports approximately 80 million ounces of silver annually from Latin America, primarily for its solar panel and electronics industries. Without Mexican and Peruvian supply, European manufacturers face production disruptions within 90 days as existing inventory depletes. At 2:15 p.m. Brussels time, the European Commission convened an emergency session on critical raw material supply disruption. The meeting produced no statement, which suggests disagreement among member states on how to respond. Germany, with its massive solar build-out, needs silver desperately. Hungary and Poland, less dependent on silver-intensive industries, may resist confrontational responses that could disrupt other trade relationships. The lack of unified response is itself a signal. If the EU had leverage to reverse the restrictions, they would have announced it. Their silence suggests they don't. This is what resource nationalism looks like when it arrives in force. The decrees announced this morning aren't isolated decisions by two governments acting independently. They're the beginning of a pattern that will spread to other nations and other minerals. Silver is concentrated. Lithium is concentrated. The lithium triangle of Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia controls 65% of global reserves. Cobalt is concentrated. The DRC produces 70% of global supply. Rare earths are concentrated. China controls 80% of processing. Every concentrated mineral is vulnerable to the same strategic logic that Mexico and Peru applied this morning. If exporting raw materials while importing finished goods is economically irrational for silver, it's economically irrational for lithium and cobalt and rare earths. The template has been established. The legal language has been tested. The market response has demonstrated that restrictions work, that nations can prioritize domestic needs without immediate catastrophic consequences. Other governments are watching. Other decrees will follow. The integrated global supply chain for critical minerals, the system that delivered raw materials from low-cost producers to high-value-added manufacturers wherever they were located, is fragmenting in real time. Some will look at this morning's restrictions and see negotiating tactics. We'll assume that Mexico and Peru want better terms, higher prices, larger investments, and will lift restrictions once they get what they want. We'll trust that markets always find equilibrium, that trade always flows, that restrictions always fail. These are the same voices that said Russia would never cut off gas to Europe, that said China would never restrict rare earth exports, that said resource nationalism died with the 1970s. The voices are always confident that rational economic actors will behave rationally, until they behave strategically instead. Others will recognize what this morning represents: the most concentrated supply shock in silver market history, the template for similar restrictions across critical minerals, the end of the assumption that raw materials will flow freely from producing nations to consuming nations simply because markets demand it. The informed are not predicting silver at $200 or $300 or any specific number. Price predictions in supply crises are meaningless because the range of outcomes is too wide. What the informed recognize is that 68% of tradable supply has been restricted, that inventories can bridge perhaps 75 days of the resulting gap, that demand destruction sufficient to balance the market requires prices multiples of current levels, and that no mechanism exists to force Mexico and Peru to resume exports. This is not financial advice. This is not a recommendation to buy silver at the indicated $94 price, a price that may gap higher or collapse if restrictions are modified before implementation. This is simply a description of what happened at 6 a.m. Eastern this morning, and what the arithmetic of supply and demand implies about what happens next. 336 million ounces from Mexico and Peru. Another 220 million ounces processed from their concentrate. A total of 556 million ounces, 68% of supply, now subject to government authorization. The authorizations may be granted generously, and supply may resume with minor disruption. The authorizations may be granted sparingly, and supply may collapse permanently. The authorizations may be used as leverage for trade negotiations that take months or years to resolve. Nobody knows which path the governments will choose. Nobody knows what prices will balance a market where 68% of supply disappeared overnight. Nobody knows whether this morning's decrees are the beginning of a crisis or just a negotiating tactic. What we know is this. At 6 a.m. Eastern this morning, two governments announced that 68% of global silver reaching international markets now requires their permission. They didn't ask permission from the markets. They didn't warn the refiners who depend on their output. They didn't consult the manufacturers whose assembly lines require their silver. They simply announced that they decide now, not the market, not the traders, not the consumers. Two governments, two decrees, 68% of supply. The great silver squeeze wasn't engineered by hedge funds or retail traders or Reddit forums. It was engineered by Mexico City and Lima. And there's nothing the market can do about it except pay whatever price clears the metal that remains.